Hi, my name's Heather, and I will be talking about the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018. The original Juvenile Justice and Detention Prevention Act was in 1974. And the original ideology of the original 1974 Act was to standardize the treatment of youth across the nation. It did establish the Office of Juvenile Justice and Detention Prevention and aimed to highlight that there are differences between youth and adult offenders. This was not the first time, though, that this had been recognized, because the first U.S. juvenile court was actually established about a century ago by social workers. They had already recognized then that young people are amenable to rehabilitation, and this happened in Illinois. Things unfortunately took a turn for our youth justice system in the 80s and 90s. There became tremendous pressure to be tough on crime. The U.S. saw a spike in violent crimes across the nation, and it was seen as the crack epidemic, and the theme became to be tough on crime, catch them while they're young before they can commit worse crimes. And the system was still seen at this time as rehabilitative. This is also when we began to see youth serving adult sentences and being convicted of adult crimes. And one of the sayings was, adult crime gets adult time. The call for reform really started in 2005 with the advances in technology. Researchers finally acquired the ability to provide actual empirical data that these are children with brains that are still developing. They could actually demonstrate with pictures that these brains are still malleable and changeable into adulthood. By this time, also, juvenile facilities were becoming widely known as cramped, underfunded, and with a shortage of resources and services. It also became a prime ground for abuse, physically and mentally, of these kids. And it also, unfortunately, became a recruiting ground for gangs. Kids were forced to pick one gang or the other for their own protection. And unfortunately, this is still happening today. We're also now recently learning about the trauma research is showing that juvenile justice system is actually doing more harm than good. So in 2018, there was a major national reform. The four core principles of the reform were number one, the first one expands upon a previous policy addition that decriminalizes status offenses. So this means kids cutting school, breaking curfew, possession of alcohol. These were no longer things that could land a juvenile in detention. So to this list, they added youth in violation of a valid court order. They did leave a caveat that law enforcement could go to great lengths through the courts to get the juvenile detained, but then even if they did, they could only hold them for a maximum of 10 days. Second was that youth may not be held in the same facility, adult jails or lockups, except for 6 hours before and after a court hearing and 24 hours on holidays and weekends. The exception to this is juveniles that have already been tried and convicted as an adult. So even before if they haven't been convicted yet, they have a right to be in juvenile detention centers. This actually was challenged recently with the boy from Michigan who shot other students. And they did request that the court place him in the juvenile system so he could continue classes. And in that case, it was actually denied because he was seen as a threat to the safety of other juveniles. The reform also added the sight and sound separation. This was created to keep youth convicted of an adult crime away from any possible contact with adult detainees. So they can be at the same facility, but they are to have no sight or sound contact with them at any point. Even on the cafeteria, yard, outside in the yards, nowhere. Children in adult jails have been found to be more likely to suffer permanent trauma and are 5 times more likely to die by suicide than children in juvenile detention centers. Last but not least, the call for reform included in 2018 was to address racial and ethnic disparities. The states were required to assess and address racial and ethnic disparities. Unfortunately, basically, it's to collect and analyze data regarding the issue, and then the state is to establish their own plan to improve things. Some additional requirements included the states had to increase diversity and specific qualifications for their state advisory boards. So now they're required to include a mental health professional, as well as someone who has expertise in adolescent development. And as mentioned earlier, the state has to gather and analyze vast amounts of data to provide to OJJDP. And in their state plan, they have to outline an effective system for improvements. And if the state fails to meet core requirements, federal funds will be withheld. The funds that are withheld get redistributed to the states in compliance. As far as results, unfortunately, there's not a lot of data. We've seen the number of children arrested and incarcerated dramatically decline. And obviously, there's the amount of trauma for youth and adult facilities has been minimized to some extent because of the sight and sound. And previously in 2016, President Obama had added that there could not be the use of solitary confinement for youth, but that was only in federal prisons, and it's still happening in some places. The real problem with the recent lack of data was obviously the pandemic, which caused its own problems in the system. There was really a lot of fear and chaos. The youth were not receiving any services during the pandemic. There was reports of youth being pepper sprayed by untrained temps and facing solitary confinement as a form of social distancing. How's it going in 2021? Unfortunately, there is still extreme racial disparities. Children of color continue to be over-criminalized, and this is at every point in our system. It starts at the school level. As far as school discipline, they're overrepresented, arrests, sentencing, and placements. 67% of children in the juvenile justice system were children of color. 41% were Black, and 21% were Hispanic. In terms of education, 1 in 3 youth in the juvenile justice system has a disability qualifying them for services. We know this as IEPs and 504s and special education, and a lot of resources and to meet the special needs of children with disabilities. This includes ADHD and learning disabilities. I've actually spoken with a probation officer in Orange County, and in her opinion and her experience, she feels that and it's obviously mostly boys, that she sees are struggling with ADHD or some other forms of learning disabilities that have been a challenge. The youth with disabilities in the system occurs at 4 times the rate that we're seeing in public schools. And they recently released a study of children incarcerated in California that were receiving education, and yet none of them tested at grade level. So this diagram highlights the racial disparity that continues today. 63% of children arrested in the U.S. are white. Yet, as we see in the diagram, this is not what's happening in the system. In the diagram, you can see cases referred means those that are to go before the court. And then cases detained are the youth that actually experience detention at some point between referral to court and the case being disposed. As you can see, although white youth are arrested at the highest rate, they are not incarcerated at the same rate as other racial and ethnic groups. A recent story came to my mind of the prep school East Coast boy. Some of you may have heard about it. I believe he admitted to assaulting 6 or 8 girls, and a white, middle-aged male judge sentenced him to probation because he felt that was all that was required. The reforms are helping. We are seeing some results. We're headed in the right direction, but a lot more can be done. California is actually leading the way in really moving forward with reforms. In the last decade or so, California has passed legislation to automatically seal juvenile records, end all solitary confinement in the state, and limit the placement of youth in private residential facilities. Most recently, it's my favorite, there has finally been a ban on police interrogation of youth under the age of 18 until the youth has been able to consult with an attorney. So youth are finally protected, and a child under the age of 18 can no longer waive their own Miranda rights. I think this will have a huge impact, and I also think it will have a great positive impact to help address the racial disparities. As moving forward, I think it's going to be most important to spread the word. There's usually strong support for programs that benefit youth. Unfortunately, most people are not aware of the lack of supports and resources. Some people still feel that the system's still rehabilitative. Some people still feel like the kids need to be punished to learn their lesson. A lot of people still are not even aware of the stiff penalties that have been handed out to juveniles in the last few decades. And the more information and stories and statistics that we can get out there increases the opportunity for change at the national level. There are fortunately plenty of groups and tremendous amounts of data available. So we as individuals need to push for more reform and funding of services and preventative resources. Thank you for watching, and please see my references below.